Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, August 11th. I'm very, very happy to see you all. My name is Heather, and I am the founder of an organization called We All Count, which is a project for equity in data. And as you know, if you've been here before, and welcome if this is your first Friday with us, one of my favorite things that we do is we get together almost every Friday at this time to have an informal Zoom gathering that we call Talking Data Equity. And the whole purpose of Talking Data Equity is to kind of create a space where anybody in any sector at any level of technical proficiency who is trying to understand a data project with an equity lens or create research with an equity lens can come together, talk about the concrete realities of trying to do that, what it really means and looks like, maybe learn some new things, share some new resources, and most importantly, remember that you are not alone in trying to do this, that there are other people who are having similar successes to you, similar struggles to you, and finding solutions that we can use to cross-pollinate. So welcome. Means a ton to me that you are here. Of course, nobody is looking for more ways to spend time on Zoom. So I really, really appreciate that you're here. And sometimes on Talking Data Equity, we have a technical or data-oriented topic that we talk about, and sometimes we have a special guest. And today is the second kind. We have a special guest today that I am very, very excited about. So I'm going to introduce the special guest, and how the logistics work here is that I'm going to introduce the special guest, and then they're going to share some examples and some stories. They're going to share some slides. And while they're sharing slides and stories, we ask that you stay on mute. And feel free to ask questions and record questions, put them into the Zoom chat. You can put them into the Zoom chat with the drop-down menu set to everyone so that everybody who's here can see your question. Or if you feel more comfortable, just direct messaging me your question and I'll amplify it as best I can later. That's also completely fine. And then after the slide sharing storytelling part of Talking Data Equity is over, that's when anybody who's here in person gets an opportunity to raise their hand and come off mute and ask a question. Okay, so that's what it looks like. And just to answer the question that you're all going to ask, yes, this is being recorded. Yes, we're going to share the recording and resources in the We All Count Data Equity Community Forum, which is a public resource. You can access it at any point. The link's in the chat. All right. So enough about that. Welcome to Talking Data Equity. Our special guest today is Kelsie Acton. And first off, I'll let you know that Kelsie's coming to us from Paris, France, which is super cool. Kelsie is a postdoctoral fellow with an organization called the Institute for Social Justice at York St. John. And when she's working with them, she is managing, a research project called I'm Me, which explores learning disabled and autistic artists' understanding of identity, representation, and voice. Also, Kelsie is a member of the Critical Design Lab, which is where I met them, a multinational, multidisciplinary arts and design collab that is centered in disability culture and crypt technoscience. And when they're working with the Critical Design Lab, Kelsie manages the Remote Access Archive, which I highly recommend you check out, which is an archive of the way that disabled people have connected and created culture at a distance, which is, I know, an important topic for a number of research projects that my friends here are working on. Also, Kelsie is a plain language translator, which we're going to learn a lot about what that means today. And very notably, she works for McSweeney's The Audio Issue, which is another cool resource, and Alice Wong's Year of the Tiger, and has a chapter on plain language in the recently published book called Crip Authorship, which was edited by Rebecca Sanchez and Mara Mills. And yes, all of that will be linked for your convenience at our website, but not at our website, at our Community Data Equity Forum. So I will now be quiet and turn it over to Kelsie. Thank you so much, Kelsie, for being with us and for being with us during your vacation in Paris.
It's all good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to share slides because slides are the way I stay organized and don't wander off. I'm Kelsie. My pronouns are she, her. They is also totally welcome as well. I'm a white woman with curly brown hair, late 30s, clear glasses, sat in front of a brick wall. As I talk, I'm going to describe any images, and I've also got some key points summarized on the slides, but I'm not always going to read them out. Finally, I think that from the sound of the space, this is true already, but this, like everything I do, is relaxed. So you're welcome to do what you need to do to pay attention, and I'm not going to make any assumptions about what that looks like. So that might include stimming or fidgeting on camera, having your camera off entirely, talking to yourself with the mic off. I just want to invite you to be as you are and as you need to be for the next little bit. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to very quickly define some terms that I think are useful to contemporary conversations on disability and access in Canada. Because I'm meeting you for the first time, it's totally possible I'm talking about things you already know. And if I say things that are different from what you've heard before, that's actually really interesting to me and I want to talk about it. Because disability culture is never just one thing, it's always multiple cultures. So there are a lot of different ways of talking about disability and impairment and access. With that, I also want to start by talking about language. Disability language is incredibly complicated and very geographically and community specific. So I'm almost certainly going to use terms like disabled and neurodivergent because I use them for myself. I'm also going to use the terms like people with disabilities. All of these shifts in language have meaning, and if you're familiar with disability communities, they're probably actually going to tell you a lot about the communities I'm talking about. But I'm also not going to be offended if in the Q&A or the chat, you use language that is different than mine, or even language that might be considered outdated. I care far, far more about the content of the questions you're asking than the way you're asking it. So with that, I'm also going to talk you through an incomplete history of plain language, because I always think history helps us understand where we are and why we are where we are. And I'll talk a bit about where plain language shows up in disability cultures. That'll transition us into thinking about who plain language is for and how we do plain language. I'll offer some practical tools and places that you might want to think about plain language in your work. So with that, let's start with disability rights. This is the steps of the American Capitol. Bodies cover the stairs, empty wheelchairs at the bottom, and a row of cameramen at the top. This is the Capitol crawl, a key moment in the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Around the world, disability rights as a social movement takes off in the 1960s. And disability rights essentially says that disabled people have the right to be full and equal members of society. Disability rights activists have often focused on integration into the workforce, policy and legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act or the relatively recent Accessible Canada Act as drivers of inclusion. Disability justice. So in this poster, Leroy Moore, a Black disabled man, is visible from the waist up. He holds his hands out, palms up. Green and white text reads, "All bodies are unique and essential. All bodies are whole. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful, not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. We move together with nobody left behind." This is disability justice. So in Canada and the States, disability justice is the other big disability movement you've probably heard about. It emerges in 2005 in the Bay Area of California, and it's developed by a group of queer disabled artists of color working with a performance group called Sins Invalid. And it's very much a reaction to the injustices of the disability rights movement. Ultimately, the disability rights movement, although making great strides, has often prioritized the access and well-being of white, straight, cis men with disabilities, particularly those with stable physical impairment. Disability justice is really nuanced, it's really complex, but I think it'll suffice to say for this that it is radically intersectional and also radically anti-capitalist in its approach. But what unites disability rights, disability justice, and many, many different disability cultures is a focus on access. And there's a lot of ways to think about access. So it's going to be a little bit of a theme here that everything is multiple. So access can be logistical and compliance-based. It can be radical and relational, and it can be a source of aesthetic inspiration. But I think this quote from Elizabeth Alsalser in her book, Restricted Access, Media, Disability, and the Politics of Participation is a really good starting place for us today. So Alsalser says, first, access must be understood not in terms of availability, affordability, or choice, but in terms of an individual's ability to engage meaningfully with a medium/technology and its content. Second, a hegemonic user position is created by digital media technologies and their usages. And this user position is not neutral, but perpetuates an able-bodied norm and contributes to the inequalities of access. So I just want to take a moment with this. Although Alsalser is talking about digital access, she's making a claim that is incredibly important in terms of thinking about accessibility, especially plain language. And that claim is that access requires engagement not just with the medium or technology, but also with the content that the medium is conveying. Those three little words and its content are actually like quite huge in the context of access work. I find we often think about all the ways we can convey information. So we have audio versions, written versions, large print, multiple sign language logs, but we often don't take that final step and ask if the person receiving the information can use the content and engage with it. Second, Alsalser is making the argument that we assume particular types of people use digital media technology, and that those people, our imagined users, have all the capacities we associate with able-bodiedness/able-mindedness. And in many ways, this is what I want you to start to think about as we talk about plain language. Who do we assume reads our writing? And what assumptions are we making about how they read? Which brings us to plain language. This is the US government's definition of plain language, and I love it very much because it is very plain. The definition is plain language, also called plain writing or plain English, is communication your audience can understand the first time they read or hear it. I should note here that we're going to be primarily talking about plain language in writing, mostly because I personally have not figured out how to speak plainly. And I also want to acknowledge that that means I'm excluding particular people who need both audio and plain language. So I'm not perfect. There's also no perfect access, but there's also a huge number of ways to do things better. So what is the context and history of plain language? Without any particular historical evidence, I think it's fair to say that as soon as people started writing, other people had opinions about their writing. Going back to the 14th century, we have evidence of people complaining about other people writing in fancy, complex ways. But plain language as an idea really starts to gain traction in the 1960s and the 1970s as part of the consumer rights movement. And this is a worldwide movement that advocated for things like truth in advertising, product safety standards, and a lot of other really vital things. Plain language comes in here because if you're, say, signing a contract for your electricity or your Wi-Fi, you need to be able to understand that contract. Or if you're trying to return a defective product, you need to be able to understand the company's return policies. And around the world, plain language starts to be required in a lot of different sectors and a lot of disciplines. It's a requirement for Australian legal documents. It is theoretically required by the US government. And in some parts of Canada, there's a push to use it in medical communications. The really interesting thing is that the International Standards Organization, the ISO, just a couple of weeks has released an international standard for plain language, which I'll sort of talk about, but mostly to say that I haven't read it yet in a little bit. And along the way, plain language also starts to become used as an access tool in disability communities. So the first place disabled people really start using plain language is the self-advocacy movement. Self-advocacy starts in the 1960s in Sweden in social clubs for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or IDD. And the idea is essentially that people with IDD should be able to make decisions about their own lives. And there's a big emphasis on speaking up and telling people what you want. And as the idea of self-advocacy spreads around the world, self-advocates become involved in the push for deinstitutionalization, which is the idea that they and other disabled people should live in their communities and not hospitals and institutions. Plain language becomes incredibly important to the self-advocacy movement because if people are going to live in their communities, be a part of society, and make decisions for themselves, they need access to information they can understand to help them inform those decisions. Image of a book cover with colorful overlapping triangles. In black text, the cover reads, "Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories from the 21st Century," edited by Alice Wong. So lots of self-advocacy organizations create plain language explainers, which are resources for communities. For example, when COVID started and lockdowns happened, a lot of groups put out plain language explainers about what COVID was, what the local rules were. But the moment I remember plain language sort of coming out of self-advocacy organizations and online autistic spaces I was in and into broader disability cultures was a plain language translation of Disability Visibility by Sarah Luderman. I was sort of blown away because Luderman's introduction was the first place I'd seen somebody say that the way we communicate in disability culture is actually a barrier. Something I'd seen and recognized. I'd occasionally experienced it myself during periods of burnout or intense pain, but I'd never seen it articulated so clearly. So now, having talked like very, very widely about how plain language shows up in disability cultures, I want to say that also plain language can be a tool for a lot of different people. In context of consumer rights, plain language is a tool for people who need information really quickly and don't have time to read complex documents. In disability contexts, it's absolutely used by people with IDD, but it can also be used by people who have brain fog, which is cognitive impairment from things like seizures, exhaustion from ME or long COVID, people in pain, people who are working in their second languages, maybe because their first language is a sign language or another oral language, and people who have barriers to reading, sometimes from ADHD or autism or lots of other reasons I haven't thought of. It can be a very, very broad tool. And here's a few places where I think about how you might use that tool. Interdisciplinary contexts, especially when you're articulating the value of your work to funders or other folks who have a say in what you're doing. If you can really clearly and quickly articulate what you're doing and why, I really believe that you have a better chance of buy-in. Recruitment and informed consent. So I love working with people on research, and I understand the time and energy of people who participate in my research as a gift. So I need to be able to explain really quickly and clearly why the research is worth their time and what their rights are when they work on research with me. Plain language can be a tool to make your consent forms and your interview or focus group guides better and more meaningful. And knowledge translation. This is my sort of personal favorite. We already have some medical and scientific journals that ask for lay abstracts, which can be seen as a form of plain language. But also, I really ultimately believe that research and data should be useful to people who don't have a background in it. I think there's important and robust conversations going on across a lot of disciplines and spaces about open access publishing. But I'd love a lot of us who do research to take a good hard look at ourselves and ask, if I can't clearly explain my work to somebody who's outside my field, who hasn't read all the things I'm citing, or somebody who has barriers to engaging with complex language, what am I doing, essentially? So with that slightly provocative question, I'm going to take you through the practical stuff. This section, as I noted, is not based on the ISO's new standards. This section is based on some research I did about 18 months ago, combined with feedback I've received from users in my own plain language practice. But I hope it's a really good starting place. You might see a few things that you might want to try and implement in your own writing. So in this research, I took a look at 5 different documents from around the world that lay out how to do plain language. I identified a total of 72 ways to make your language more plain, and of these, only 13 suggestions were common to all the documents. So obviously there's a lot of difference and a lot of nuance and variation. But here are the 13 plus an additional one from my users. You want to know who you're writing for. This is probably the hardest. Often I end up writing things for the internet where I don't know who's going to be reading it. So I like to think about people in my life who use plain language and imagine them as my readers. You want to put your information in an order that makes sense. Use headings to help guide readers through the document. Write short sentences. Use active voice. Use contractions like don't and couldn't. Use you for the reader and we for the organization preparing the document. Don't use unnecessary words. Try not to shorten words or use abbreviations. Use words to mean what they usually mean. Use words or phrases that help the reader move between paragraphs or points. Test your documents and give definition and or context. The last one comes very specifically from users I've worked with, especially folks who deal with significant pain or fatigue. They've sort of explained to me that if you make them move outside the document in order to understand the context or look up a definition, often they've lost where they are by the time they come back. So it's helpful if everything lives within the document and you don't have to sort of search outside for the information. I'm going to help ground you in all this, I'm going to give a short example of what plain language could look like. So in the summer of 2020, Critical Design Lab published our statement on design commitments to abolishing white supremacy. We wrote them very quickly. And as a result, I did the plain language version very quickly. I don't think this works my best, but I think it's like a
One second. Let us see if we can fix this. It's yeah, hold on one second. I'm just going to see if I can get Kelsie back. I'm going to mute myself, but we are working on it. Hi, Kelsie.
I'm so sorry. Where did I cut
no
off?
worries. No worries. As we all know, it's not unusual when it doesn't work. It's a miracle when it does work. So if you could just start back at the beginning of the example, I think that would probably be the best place. And we can't see your screen anymore.
Magic.
Great. Perfect.
Have we got the screen back? Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yep. Hey, we're happy to have you back.
Yay. So in the summer of 2020, Critical Design Lab published our statement on design commitments to abolishing white supremacy. We wrote them very quickly, and as a result, I did the plain language version quite quickly. So I don't think this is my best work, but I'm going to take you through principle 2 out of several principles, and then I'll take you through the plain language version. So principle 2 says, we affirm the value of direct action as a design tactic. Built environments are strategic sites of design intervention. Tactics of direct action as design can be found throughout the history of Black liberation movements, such as in sit-ins that put bodies on the line for justice. These tactics are also found in the design of mutual aid projects that intervene into conditions of geographic isolation and material deprivation, such as the Black Panthers' Free Breakfast for Children programs. Inspired by these tactics, direct action as a liberatory design has been a cornerstone of disability activism, manifested in large public demonstrations where bodies come into conflict with inaccessible built environments, sometimes with sledgehammers or assistive devices. The legacy of protest as design and world building recognizes the non-innocence of design-built structures, that in them we find both oppression and opportunity for symbolic and material liberation. Okay, we'll just breathe. That's a lot. And here's what I shifted it to, with the note that I think it leaves out a couple of important things when I read it again. We support direct action. Direct action is when people do things themselves to reach their goals instead of working through government. This can include sit-ins, strikes, street blockades, and property destruction. For example, the Black Panther free breakfast for children fed over 10,000 hungry Black children each day. Disabled activists learned from the Black Panthers and other Black activists. Disabled activists often protest by showing inaccessibility. Disabled people also protest by changing spaces to make them more accessible. Direct action can be a way of showing the violence of the world or changing the violence. So with that to ground you, how do we do this? What's the process? I quite literally start with, I read the document and I ask, what's the most important thing this document is trying to do? And then I write it down. And then I write down the next most important things. And I keep writing until I feel like all the really key points of a document are written down. And then I start to think about structure. What's the clearest, easiest way for readers to encounter these ideas? Is it the same structure that the original writer used? If not, what's the other option? How do I lay out the writing on the page to help readers move through it? Well, we haven't talked a lot about it here. There's really important design considerations that can make information clearer and easier to read. Also, do I need to define any words or concepts that get used a lot and are used in very specific ways? And as I do that, I keep editing my work over and over and over again, always looking for the clearest, plainest way to say what I need. And then when I think I have something, I like to start testing with two tools. These tools have downsides, but I think they help me look critically at my work. So the first is UpperGoer 6. This actually started as a popular science tool. The challenge was for scientists to explain complex concepts using very, very common English words. So I'm just going to show you some text I pulled from today's Guardian. We'll reshare. So if you drop text into this website, I think we're back, it will show you how common these words in the English language are. So I can scroll over to psychiatry, and psychiatry is the 12,087th most common word in English. If we take a look at became is the 1,961st most common word. This has not been updated recently, so there are some big gaping holes in it. But I also think it's sometimes a useful tool for me to say, I want to use the 8,000 most common words in English or the 3,000 most common words and try and aim my language towards that. The other tool I often take a look at is the Flesch-Kincaid test. This gives you a score based on the average syllables per word and the average number of words per sentence. I like this one because I am very bad at writing short sentences, and it's always a very good check for me. So I'll just quickly show you this one as well. So I've dropped that same sort of first 3 paragraphs from The Guardian in here. And if I hit calculate, Flesh Kincaid will tell me, firstly, that the reading level is quite difficult and that the average number of words per sentence are 25. It's really worth noting here that the Flesh Kincaid test assumes that there's a quote unquote normal way to learn to read. And as somebody who did not learn to read quote unquote normally, I have some objections to that. But the reason why I use these tools is not because I think there's some sort of like really defined or great arbiter of what's good or what the standards should be. It's a tool I use to help myself step back from the writing. And there's a ton of readability tools out there on the internet. Any of them will help you do this. It's really just about finding a tool that you feel like works for you. And then in a dream world, you would work with someone who uses plain language to test the document and see what is and isn't clear. So depending on who your user is, you may get very different feedback. And I'll say in plain language, coming from disability culture, often it feels very, very different. I suspect because everyone who's doing plain language work is working with very different users. I have a grant in to do some more research on that. Cross your fingers for me. So to sum up really quickly, plain language is like many access practices, a messy and evolving and like very beautiful practice. These things are not objective standards. There's no way to like do plain language perfectly, but it's a tool to bring you into relationship and into contact with people you might not be reaching or might not be in contact with. I've heard something, I hope you've heard something today that sparks your curiosity or that you might take and try in your own practice. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing and see if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Kelsie. It was extremely helpful to have such a grounded walkthrough of the origin and, a current example of the work that folks are doing with plain language. And there are a lot of questions in the chat that are extremely relevant and thoughtful. So thank you, everyone, as usual. Before we get to the chat questions, I'm going to see, is there anyone here who wants to raise their hand and come off of mute to ask a question? And you can do that by using the little reaction button, which is a smiley face with a plus on its head, usually. You can raise your hand that way, or you can just put yourself into the chat. Go ahead, Celia. Hi, how are you?
Hi,
Good to see you.
good morning. So something I'm really interested about is utilizing community-informed data and data that is relevant to the people that I am sourcing it from, and then presenting it in ways that is relevant to the ways that they want to engage with information. In what ways have you done this? What methods have you used to do it? It's one of those things that you can put as a priority, and it is so much easier said than done.
Oh my gosh. This is a really beautiful question. So I think it's very much evolving and very much based on where I'm working and how I'm engaging. So the first place I started doing plain language, or at least trying, not sure I did it well, was in my dissertation research, because I really realized I was working with one of the dancers I was working with was absolutely not going to be able to provide meaningful feedback on my analysis unless I put it into plain language for him. But with the project I'm working on at York St. John right now, we're still it's co-created. So we're still like planning and figuring that out with folks. But we're starting to think about video seems to be like very accessible for a lot of learning disabled folks and engaging in a way that seems exciting. So we'll probably go in and play with how do we provide summaries in video form? What does that look like? Do we have like easy read slides that we talk over? Does it need to be people talking? And I think sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but I think a lot of this is just like trial and error, and also not trying to account for absolutely everyone who could engage the research, but saying, I'm working very specifically with you, and I'm going to try and make this research project accessible to you. So what are your communication preferences? I hope I sort of answered the question in the tangent. Awesome. Thank you.
That is an excellent question. Thank you so much. I think that question was in the minds of lots of people. Anyone else want to raise their hand? And while you're thinking about it, I'm going to start with the chat here. And there's a lot of questions in the chat. We have a few people, some in the thread with everybody, some direct messaging me, that are asking a really common thing, which is a theme, talking data equity, which is about the intended audience. And I know that you talked about, the first thing that you said was when you're going to use plain language, you have to consider your intended audience. And one of the questions is for the example that you gave, because that was, really about racial equity, racial justice, things like that. How does considering the racial identity of the intended audience matter? Because like what you're going to need to define, and we see this over and over and over again, what you need to define, what assumptions you're going to make really varies by culture.
Hugely. And I think I have no answers that I feel 100% settled on, but I'll sort of talk through maybe some of the work I did with Alice Wong on Year of a Tiger, because I was actually quite initially hesitant to take the work because I am white. And Alice and I had a little bit of a chat about, because there are not a lot of people working in plain language in disability culture, it felt more important to her to have a disabled plain language translator than someone who, had family experiences of emigrating from Hong Kong. And sort of what we ended up with was, firstly, obviously, Alice checked the plain language translation I did, because she's the person who knows her own experiences and her own culture best. So I had that sort of level of check in there. I also made really sure that one of my user testers for that work was also Black and a plain language user, because I felt in a piece that's navigating like disability culture, but also the complexities of race within the United States, I felt like that perspective was a really important one to have, to sort of be a check for me. And Dominic was like, I think did a great job in pushing me sometimes to be like very direct and very clear about the violence in ways that I think sometimes my initial instinct was to soften or dull in the translation. So I think choosing who you're working with to test the text becomes incredibly important. The other consideration for Alice's work, I was like quite I have questions about this, but I feel okay politically about it, is Alice often, a lot of the text is in Mandarin and then translated into English. So I made very sure in the plain language translation that we preserved all the Mandarin, and had a Mandarin speaker come in and check that I had like copied things over and hadn't messed up the meanings, because I absolutely do not speak Mandarin. And even though that might have like interrupted readers' flow or might have made some readability challenges, it felt really essential to the purpose of the work and sort of the political intentions behind it.
That makes
Maybe I will
so
make
much sense.
choices in 10 years, but yeah, sorry, thank you.
Apologies for interrupting. I think we have a little bit of a delay, I think, across continents. But that makes so much sense. Thank you for explaining in such a specific, concrete way with a real example about, how to make choices that kind of retain the purpose of the writing while being attentive to intersectional cultural implications. Very interesting topic. On the topic of you not speaking Mandarin, I know that you said at the top, that this was an English-centric talk today because you're going to be speaking in English. But it sounded like also plain language maybe started in Sweden. When it started in Sweden, was it dealing with Swedish or was it dealing with English?
No, so plain language, I think these histories are complicated and I haven't been able to trace them particularly in detail. But as part of the consumer rights movement, it's worldwide. There's plain language in like many, many languages. But of course, because I only speak English and extremely bad French, I'm only working in English and with English-centered disability culture work.
Yeah. Okay. That is really good to know. What about a couple of questions about what about the idea of simply writing something in plain language to begin with? Is that what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, please do that. That's probably much easier.
I mean, I guess part of the reason that, some types of scientists don't is because they want to speak to each other in kind of a shorthand. But, I was just involved in a very interesting kind of heated argument the other day about the relative importance of the speed of knowledge creation in proportion to the speed of knowledge translation and who gets prioritized when we're devoting resources to support knowledge creation or knowledge translation. Go ahead, Kyle.
Hi, yeah, thank you all so much. This is incredibly interesting. I had a question, just because this seems very grounded in tech space. And I'm just wondering with data and graphs and visuals, if you have any advice, guidance on how to present data in sort of the plain language context that makes it easy to sort of read and digest.
I think what I can say is I know there's at least one researcher doing really brilliant work around data visualization and accessibility. I cannot remember her name right now, but I can try and find it for Heather. And I think the basics are like have words versions as well. For some people, the visual will be more accessible. For some people, the words will be more accessible. But after that, it gets like very complex and very cool. But I do not know a heck of a lot about it.
Yeah, it's a great question, though. Layers upon layers of what counts as plain is very present once we get to data visualization. It's a really important question. Yeah, send me the name when you find that person, and maybe we'll see if they'll come on and help us out with that. Lots of people want to circle back to something you said when you were giving us the 13 recommendations. There's an extensive conversation going on about contractions. Some people are like, what's up with the contractions? Also, is that really good for people who are native language speakers? And does it make it harder if they're not? Do you have any insights around that? Well, we're not asking you to, say this is the one thing you should always do. We know that that doesn't exist. But what's your experience with contractions?
Yeah, so the thinking behind that is you want to make it colloquial. You don't want it to feel formal. You want it, because people are often encountering more spoken language than written. I think you can question the assumptions underlying that statement, but the idea is to make it sound like you're chatting to somebody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes
That's all
sense.
it is. You cannot use contractions if you really want to hold on to them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of talk in the chat about informed consent and who gets advantaged by having very technical, confusing language in there. And that, you can write something in plain language and then you send it to your legal department and they send it back all marked up with, not plain language. Do you have resources on the legal aspects of plain language?
I would say I do not, especially as it relates to university consent processes. I think also because universities are wildly different. I've had experiences where we worked very hard on a plain language consent form and got told, no, absolutely not. It had to be the mandated form with just the boxes filled in. And then I've also had experiences where the university was like, sure, that looks cool. So
yeah,
I think it really deeply depends where you are.
Yeah. Mish in the chat is making a good point as well, that this is often the case in academic journal writing. If you, to some journals, if you submit something that's written in a plain language way, they send it back and say, make that fancier. Ugh. Yes.
Yeah, I think there's really complex stuff going on, and who are you within the research world? Do you have the clout to push for this? I mean, I don't particularly want anyone whose early career or precarious to feel like they shouldn't publish because they can't do plain language. That's not actually going to serve anybody.
That's a really, really good point. Do you have the clout to push for this? I like the way that you phrase that a lot. And that is kind of one of the things that why we have this gathering on Fridays, so that, maybe one person doesn't have the clout, but as a collective, we can sometimes find the clout. And as Chris is saying in the chat, let's start a plain language journal. So maybe we'll have to start a data equity journal where there's all kinds of different things that we're amplifying and raising up. So our time has been reached, which is always amazing to me how fast talking data equity goes. I wish we could spend more time because there are still lots of questions in the chat. But as promised, we will share this recording and the resources in our data equity forum, which is not a membership site. You don't have to pay money to see it, and it is hosted on a a proprietary server, so it doesn't serve you ads or follow you across the internet. So feel free to continue to ask your questions there, because there's always people with lots of good ideas that are willing to share their experiences and their ideas if we didn't quite get to your question. And I think we will leave it there. And Kelsie, in the chat, you should know that there are lots and lots of people saying how wonderful and useful and meaningful this was, and how grateful we are that you took an hour to share your expertise. And we're really, really looking forward to continuing to explore the resources and tools you shared with us, and move the needle in this direction as well. It means the world to us. And for everyone else in the community who joined us today, thank you so much for coming. We'll never, ever get to data equity without people like you. So thank you for joining us. We are back next Friday with Dr. Carrie Jordan from the Data Carpentries. So another interesting guest speaker. And take really good care of yourselves, and take really good care of each other, and have a really good weekend. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. It was such a pleasure.
Thanks, Kelsie. Talk to you later. Bye.